A murder wrapped in holiday cheer. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I am your host, Mithrin. Tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing this community grow. Your comments make these mysteries shine brighter. Let's step into the story. The snow had begun to fall early that December morning, dusting the roofs of St. Mary Mead in a soft white powder that turned every hedge and thatched roof into something resembling an illustration from a Christmas card. The villagers, long accustomed to the small excitements of rural life, welcomed the season's festivities with extra cheer. On that particular evening, the vicarage shone with lamplight and good spirits. Reverend Clement and his wife Griselda had thrown open their doors for what had now become a village tradition, the annual Christmas party. A towering tree stood proudly in the corner of the drawing room, bedecked with ornaments gathered over years of parochial hospitality. Children darted about with sticky fingers clutching sweets, while the adults laughed and clinked glasses of mulled wine. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably in an armchair near the fire, was knitting, though her eyes as ever missed nothing. She observed the way Mrs. Price Ridley's lips pursed whenever young Mr. Denham, the curate, made a remark, how Colonel Melchett's booming laughter seemed just a shade louder when his wife turned her head, and how Lucy Carter, the new maid at the vicarage, blushed rather furiously when Dr. Haydock asked her the simplest of questions. It was, on the surface, a cheerful, ordinary evening. But Miss Marple knew from long experience that the most tranquil settings often concealed the deepest troubles. The merriment reached its height when it was time for the presents beneath the tree. Griselda, with her usual cheer, called out names as the packages were handed around. There was much laughter at the gifts, Colonel Melchett unwrapping a pair of absurdly long woolen socks, Mrs. Price Ridley feigning delight at a rather tasteless china figurine. And then came the moment that silenced the room. A small parcel, wrapped neatly in brown paper with a sprig of holly tied atop, was handed to Edmund Blackwell, a young man recently returned to the village after some years abroad. He gave a half-smile, tugged the string and pulled back the paper. Inside was a box, and within that box a scream cut through the laughter. For nestled on a bed of cotton wool was not a trinket, nor a joke, but a tiny glass vial half filled with a dark, amber-coloured liquid, and a note written in a precise, spidery hand to Edmund Blackwell. A poison for a poisoned soul. The chatter stopped at once. Only the crackling fire dared make a sound. Faces turned toward Edmund, whose complexion had gone deathly pale. Griselda dropped her tray of mince pies with a crash, and Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting, looked thoughtfully at the parcel, her blue eyes sharp and clear. Something, she felt, had just changed the course of the evening, and perhaps the course of the village itself. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 2? The village reacts, where gossip, suspicion and old scandals begin to surface, keeping the slow burn build-up. The silence that followed the discovery of the sinister parcel seemed to stretch on far longer than it truly did. The fire crackled, the snow pressed softly against the windows, and every person in the vicarage drawing-room looked at Edmund Blackwell as though he was suddenly a stranger among them. Edmund himself stared at the vial, his hand trembling slightly as he set it back into the box with deliberate care. "Well," said Colonel Melchett at last, his booming voice tempered by unease, "this is a damned unpleasant sort of joke." "Joke?" repeated Mrs. Price Ridley, her voice sharp. "I hardly think so, Colonel. That," she gestured toward the little bottle with a shiver of distaste, "that looks altogether too deliberate." Griselda bent quickly to retrieve the mince pies she had dropped, her face pale but her manner brisk. "Children," she said firmly, clapping her hands at the little ones who were staring wide-eyed, "off to the kitchen at once. Mrs. Baker will find you more sweets." The children scampered away reluctantly. Their laughter stilled, leaving the room to the uncomfortable silence of the adults. Miss Marple, who had resumed her knitting with calm fingers, raised her head just enough to observe Edmund. His jaw was set, though his pallor betrayed him. He looked neither shocked nor confused, but rather as though a private suspicion had just been confirmed. Reverend Clement cleared his throat, ever the peacemaker. Yes, most regrettable, of course. Perhaps it is some misguided attempt at humor. Edmund, my boy, do you know who might have sent such a thing? Edmund's lips parted, then closed again. He looked around the circle of expectant faces, Colonel Melchett standing with his shoulders squared, Mrs. Price Ridley clutching her handbag as though it were a weapon. Dr. Haydock frowning thoughtfully. Lucy the maid lingering in the doorway, pale as parchment. "I can't imagine," Edmund said finally, though the words were unconvincing. The note itself was passed around gingerly, each guest examining the sharp, spidery script. Miss Marple, when her turn came, held it close to her spectacles. The letters were precise, written by a steady hand, someone who had taken care. It was not a hurried scrawl, but rather the deliberate penmanship of a person who wished to conceal as much as they revealed. She tucked the observation away, not mentioning it aloud. "It is wicked," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley, "to bring such a thing into a Christmas party of all places. Mark my words, this village is not what it once was. Too much influence from outsiders." Her eyes flicked toward Edmund with unspoken accusation. The young man's jaw tightened. "If someone wishes to make me unwelcome, they've chosen a coward's method." He snapped the box shut and slipped it into his pocket. Colonel Melchett gave a short bark of disapproval. "You'd best hand that over to the proper authorities, Blackwell. If it's poison, and I shouldn't wonder if it is, it has no business being carried about in your coat pocket. Perhaps tomorrow," Edmund said coolly. "Tonight I'd rather not make a spectacle of myself any further." His words, though calm, carried a defiance that rippled through the company. Mrs. Price Ridley gasped audibly. Dr. Haydock opened his mouth as though to protest, then thought better of it. The tension in the room was thick enough to stifle conversation, and soon, one by one, the guests began making excuses to leave. What had begun as a cheerful gathering now dissolved into hurried farewells and whispers exchanged beneath mufflers as villagers stepped out into the snowy night. Miss Marple did not move from her chair until the room was nearly empty. When at last she rose, she found Griselda standing by the tree, her usual vivacity dimmed. "It's horrid, Jane," Griselda said quietly. "Quite horrid. Who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple gave her a small, reassuring smile. "So, my dear, people are capable of all sorts of things, particularly when they believe themselves unobserved. But you mustn't distress yourself. Likely as not, it will turn out to be less serious than it seems." Yet in her heart, Miss Marple knew it was no prank. There had been a coldness in the wording of that note, an intimate bitterness that bespoke motive. The next morning, the entire village was abuzz. St. Mary Mead had always thrived on its capacity for gossip, but now every shop, every parlour, and every lane hummed with the same topic, the dreadful incident at the vicarage party. At the post office, Miss Hartnell was heard declaring that Edmund Blackwell had made enemies long before he left for the colonies. "Oh yes," she said knowingly to anyone who would listen. "His father left the estate in a shocking muddle. There were debts, you know, and quarrels with the tenants. Mark my words, that young man will find trouble everywhere he goes. Trouble everywhere he goes." Meanwhile, in the high street, Mr. Badger the grocer shook his head gravely. "A warning, I should say. A warning meant to frighten him off. I hear he's after buying up the old Carter property. Someone doesn't want him meddling." Even in the little tea room run by Mrs. Prowse, conversation turned inevitably to Edmund. "I never trusted him," Mrs. Prowse whispered loudly to her neighbour. "All that travelling about. Australia, wasn't it, or Africa? Such places change a man. You don't come back the same." Miss Marple, on her customary walk that morning, heard it all without appearing to listen. She nodded kindly to the villagers, remarked upon the weather, and accepted the usual invitations to pause for tea or a warming sherry. But behind her gentle inquiries and mild observations, her mind was busy. Edmund Blackwell had returned to St. Mary Mead scarcely 6 months earlier, taking up residence at the neglected family house on the edge of the village. His reappearance had stirred considerable speculation. He was handsome enough, with dark eyes and a self-contained manner, but there was something guarded about him. Some said he meant to restore the estate. Others whispered he intended to sell it. A few remarked on his absence from church, and more still on his reluctance to speak of his years abroad. It was not Miss Marple's way to leap to conclusions, but she could not help noticing that Edmund himself had reacted less with surprise than with resignation when the parcel was opened. It was as though he had been expecting something unpleasant. By the afternoon, the incident had reached the ears of the police. Inspector Craddock himself came down from the county station, much to the villagers' satisfaction. Craddock was a solid man with a brisk manner. well liked in the district, though not always quick to see beyond the obvious. He called upon Edmund Blackwell at his home, Blackwell House, a grey stone building half hidden by ivy and surrounded by gardens gone wild. Miss Marple, having chosen that very afternoon to pay a neighbourly call, arrived just as the inspector was leaving. He greeted her respectfully. "Good day, Miss Marple. I suppose you've heard about last night's business." "Such things do not remain secret for long in St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I do hope Mr. Blackwell is not too distressed." Craddock gave a short laugh. "Distressed? No, he's a cool one, that fellow. Says he can't imagine who would wish him harm. But between ourselves, I think he knows more than he lets on." Miss Marple inclined her head, her knitting bag hanging from her arm. "Most people do, Inspector. It is not always what they say, but what they choose not to say that is most telling." Craddock smiled faintly. He had learned to respect Miss Marple's quiet wisdom, though he did not always follow it. "Well, we'll look into it. Could be a prank, though I'm not sure. That bottle looked genuine enough. If it is poison, then someone went to trouble." Inside, Edmund received Miss Marple with a politeness that was almost forced. His drawing-room bore the sparse air of a house recently reoccupied, bare furniture, unopened books, and the faint smell of damp that no fire seemed to banish. He offered her tea, which she accepted with gratitude. "I imagine," Miss Marple said gently, "that you must find the village rather full of questions today." Edmund gave a short laugh. "That's one way of putting it. Half the parish thinks I've made enemies everywhere I've been. The other half thinks I brought this on myself. Neither half is entirely wrong." He spoke the last words with a bitterness that surprised her. "Sometimes," Miss Marple observed, "the past has a way of following us, no matter how far we travel. People carry resentments for years. Little things forgotten by one, remembered by another. It is astonishing how often an old quarrel blooms afresh under the right circumstances." Edmund studied her keenly. "You think this is personal, then? Not just some lunatic mischief?" "I think, Mr. Blackwell, that people seldom act without reason," she said gently, "though the reasons are not always what they seem." When she left him, Miss Marple walked slowly back through the snowy lanes, her thoughts busy. She had noted the unease with which Edmund avoided certain topics, the faint tightening around his mouth when she mentioned the old estate, and the guarded glance he gave toward a photograph on the mantelpiece, a photograph of a woman whose features bore a striking resemblance to his own. By evening, the gossip had grown still wilder. Some said the vial had contained arsenic. Others whispered of exotic poisons brought back from abroad. Mrs. Price Ridley declared it must have been meant for someone else entirely. Surely no one would dare threaten Edmund openly. Miss Marple listened, nodded and smiled her gentle smile. But in her heart, she knew the village was on the edge of something darker. The parcel beneath the Christmas tree had been no accident. It was a message of hatred, perhaps of revenge, and such messages seldom ended with a single warning. As she sat by her fire that night, her needles clicking softly, Miss Marple thought of the many times she had seen how the smallest of seeds could grow into the deadliest of plants. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, resentment had taken root, and if her instincts were correct, the poison in that little vial was not the only danger awaiting the village this Christmas. "Would you like me to keep building the next section, early investigation, at a similar 1,500-plus word depth, where Miss Marple begins to notice subtle patterns in behavior, while the police fix on the wrong lead?" The days that followed the vicarage party settled into a strange quiet, though beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead, the currents of speculation and suspicion flowed faster than ever. The snow had thickened, muffling the village in a deceptive calm. But behind closed doors, voices lowered and eyes narrowed whenever Edmund Blackwell's name was spoken. Miss Marple, walking each morning to the grocer or the post office, found herself surrounded by fragments of conversation, each piece as small and seemingly harmless as the dropped stitches she sometimes corrected in her knitting, but which, when gathered together, wove a far more troubling pattern. Inspector Craddock had returned to the village more than once since that night. His presence lent both reassurance and unease, for though he was liked well enough, his brisk manner reminded the villagers that the matter was considered serious, quite serious indeed. There was no more talk of practical jokes. The vial had been taken away for examination, and while the inspector would not confirm what it contained, His grave expression suggested it was no harmless concoction. Miss Marple noticed how each time he visited, he left Edmund's house with his lips set in a line of frustration. At the Blue Boar Inn, where Mr. and Mrs. Archer kept both a modest lodging and a supply of strong spirits, conversation ran particularly hot. One evening, Miss Marple, passing by, heard the sound of Mr. Archer proclaiming loudly that Edmund had enemies before he even set foot in the place. "Look at the land," he insisted, pounding the bar with a heavy fist. "There's Carter's fields, lying fallow since old Tom passed on. Blackwell wants to buy them up, or so I hear. Plenty would stand in his way, and some might rather see him gone than give up what's theirs." To this Mrs. Archer added in a hushed voice, "And there's that matter with his cousin, isn't there? The one left high and dry when Edmund's father squandered the family's fortune. People don't forget such things." Miss Marple, who had paused discreetly outside to adjust the string of her basket, made no sign of having overheard, yet she tucked the detail away. Family quarrels, she knew, were like embers, smouldering quietly for years until a breath of circumstance brought them blazing to life. The next morning, she called upon Griselda at the vicarage, ostensibly to bring some knitted socks for the parish charity drive. Griselda, still shaken by the memory of that evening, welcomed her eagerly. "Jane," she said in a rush, "I cannot tell you how dreadful it has been. Every person I meet asks if I've discovered who did it, as though the vicar and I keep a book of village secrets by the hearth. And poor Clement, he's nearly worn himself out trying to calm people down. Such is the nature of people, my dear," Miss Marple replied softly, taking her tea with careful hands. "They always imagine the vicarage to be the heart of the village, and in a way they are not mistaken." She allowed Griselda to chatter on, listening closely, her mind arranging each scrap of gossip as though fitting puzzle pieces together. When at last she rose to go, she walked past Lucy Carter, the vicarage maid, who was scrubbing furiously at the tiled floor. The girl's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. Miss Marple stopped kindly. "You mustn't wear yourself out, Lucy," she said. "There's always tomorrow for more work," Lucy started, glancing up as though caught in a guilty thought. "Yes, ma'am," she muttered. Then, with a trembling hand, she wrung out her cloth and bent low again over the tiles. As Miss Marple walked on, she considered the maid's unease. A simple servant girl might have many reasons to be anxious, the natural fear of being drawn into village scandal, or perhaps something more. She had noticed Lucy's blush at the party when Dr. Haydock spoke to her. Young girls often blushed, of course, but this one had seemed marked by fear as much as embarrassment. Later that day, Miss Marple found herself in the company of Dr. Haydock himself. He had come to deliver medicine to Mrs. Price Ridley, who was, as always, convinced she suffered from some mortal ailment. When he emerged from her cottage, Miss Marple greeted him on the path. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, brushing the snow from his coat. "And how are you keeping? Not letting all this excitement tire you, I hope?" "Oh, I thrive on a little excitement," Miss Marple said mildly. "Though I do worry for poor Edmund. It cannot be pleasant to feel oneself the subject of so much speculation." Haydock snorted. "He bears it with a curious calm, if you ask me. Most men in his position would protest their innocence to anyone who would listen. He, on the other hand, seems almost resigned. It gives one to wonder whether he knows more than he says. You suspect him, then?" "Not suspect, precisely," Haydock said thoughtfully. "But there's something he keeps back. I've seen that look before in men, when they're carrying the weight of some secret, and every word they speak is chosen to hide it. He's not guilty of placing that parcel under the tree, of course, but he knows who might be." Miss Marple nodded gently, her eyes fixed on the snowy branches overhead. "Secrets are a heavy burden, Doctor. One can often tell when a person shoulders them, even if one cannot see the shape of the burden itself." She let the thought hang, offering no more. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock continued to pursue what seemed to him the most obvious lead. The parcel, he reasoned, must have been placed under the tree by someone present at the party. He drew up a list of all those in attendance and began his interviews methodically. Mrs. Price Ridley had been indignant at the implication, insisting she had never in her life so much as touched a bottle of poison. Colonel Melchett had thundered at the suggestion that his wife, or anyone of his household, could be suspected. Even Lucy Carter had been questioned, though her trembling hands and pale face had merely confirmed in Craddock's mind that she was a silly, nervous girl, not a criminal. Miss Marple, however, thought differently. She did not say so, of course. Instead, she listened to the inspector's progress when he shared it with her in passing, always smiling, always nodding, yet all the while fitting her own quiet observations into place. On one particular evening, as the lamps were being lit and the snow lay heavy upon the lanes, Miss Marple sat by her fire reflecting on what she had learned. The message had been addressed specifically to Edmund. It had not been vague, nor could it have been mistaken for anyone else. Whoever wrote it must have known something of his past, something damning enough to call him a poisoned soul. But how many in St. Mary Mead could truly claim to know the details of Edmund's years abroad? Very few. That suggested either a stranger who had followed him or someone within the village who had corresponded, kept watch or held old grievances long enough to act now. The clue that most stirred her thoughts, however, was not the note itself but Edmund's reaction. His fear had not been of discovery but of recognition, the way his eyes had flicked toward the faces around him, as though measuring which of them might have sent. It was the reaction of a man who already suspected his enemy's identity, and then there was Lucy. That poor girl's nerves were far too frayed for mere village chatter. Something weighed heavily upon her, and Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing young women in small villages, recognized the signs of a heart entangled, whether by affection, fear, or guilt. She resolved to watch Lucy closely, though never in a way that would frighten her further. 2 evenings later, Miss Marple attended a small supper at Mrs. Price Ridley's house, where the talk, as expected, turned again to the Blackwell matter. Colonel Melchett, puffing on his pipe, declared it was high time Edmund came clean about his affairs abroad. "I'll wager there's some unsavory business following him back here," he said, his eyes glittering with self-importance. "Men don't spend years in the colonies without making enemies." Miss Hartnell, ever eager to contribute, nodded vigorously. "And I've heard from reliable sources, most reliable, that his father had dealings most unbecoming. Debts, quarrels, perhaps even worse. The apple seldom falls far from the tree." Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly, allowing the words to wash over her. She had no doubt that much of it was exaggeration, but within exaggerations lay the kernel of truth. The past was a long shadow, and Edmund Blackwell seemed perpetually caught in its shade. When at last she returned home, she paused on her doorstep, her breath clouding in the cold night air. She felt a certainty growing in her mind. The parcel was only the beginning. Such gestures were rarely isolated. If hatred had indeed returned to St. Mary Mead under the guise of Christmas cheer, it would not remain content with a warning. And as her fire warmed her parlour and the clock chimed the hour, Miss Marple bent once more to her knitting. Her fingers moved steadily, but her thoughts ran dark. Somewhere close at hand in this very village she knew so well, a secret was tightening its hold. She could feel it, as surely as she could feel the wool slipping through her hands. The first act of malice had been played. What followed would be far more dangerous. She prayed, though she knew it was likely in vain, that when the next blow fell, it would not be too late to stop it. Would you like me to continue into the next long section, First Suspects, where Inspector Craddock begins to fix upon an obvious culprit, while Miss Marple quietly notices the inconsistencies? Inspector Craddock's instincts, though usually sound, had begun to incline toward the simplest solution. By his reasoning, if the parcel had been slipped beneath the tree at the vicarage, then it was almost certainly the work of someone within that room. And of those present, one stood out to him above the rest, not because she was cunning or clever, but precisely because she was not. Lucy Carter, the maid, had hovered near the tree most of the evening, carrying trays and tidying up as instructed. She was young, nervous, and by all appearances rather easily led. To Craddock's mind, such a girl might have been persuaded or paid to deliver the parcel without knowing its contents. The inspector's decision to call on Lucy came swiftly. One afternoon he appeared at the vicarage again, his boots dusted with snow, his expression determined. Miss Marple, who happened to be taking tea with Griselda in the drawing-room, overheard enough to realize at once where his suspicions lay. She remained silent, her needles moving, but her eyes were bright and attentive as Griselda excused herself to fetch Lucy from the scullery. When the girl appeared, she looked even paler than usual. Her apron was crumpled, her hands red from scrubbing, and her eyes darted nervously from face to face. Craddock spoke kindly enough, but there was a firmness in his tone. "Lucy Carter, you were present when the parcels were handed round at the Christmas party. Did you at any time handle the package addressed to Mr. Blackwell before it was given to him?" Lucy's lips trembled. "No, sir. I only fetched the parcels from under the tree when Mrs. Clement called the names." "I didn't look at them, I swear," Craddock pressed further. "But you were near the tree earlier in the evening, were you not? Passing by with trays, perhaps? Did anyone give you that parcel and ask you to place it there?" Lucy shook her head so violently her cap slipped. "No, sir. No one asked me. I didn't see it until I picked it up." "Please, you must believe me," Griselda, watching with sympathetic eyes, interjected. "Inspector, Lucy has been with us only a few months, but she's an honest girl. She wouldn't be mixed up in anything of this kind." Craddock remained unsatisfied. "Honest girls can be led astray, Mrs. Clement, sometimes without realizing what they are doing. Miss Marple, at that, coughed gently into her hand, a delicate interruption. "Forgive me, Inspector, but it occurs to me that if Lucy were entrusted with such a task, she would have had to conceal her fear rather better. Nervousness is a difficult thing to feign with success, and Lucy, poor child, has looked frightened every day since. A guilty party, in my experience, often carries themselves with a certain bravado. It is the innocent who quake, knowing suspicion is easily cast upon them." Craddock regarded her thoughtfully, accustomed as he was to Miss Marple's uncanny observations. He did not dismiss her words outright, but neither was he ready to let go of his theory. He took his leave shortly after, instructing Lucy to remain available should he need to speak with her again. When the door closed behind him, Lucy sank into a chair, her shoulders shaking. Griselda rushed to comfort her. Miss Marple watched quietly, saying nothing, but noting with precision the particular quality of Lucy's distress. It was not only fear of accusation, it was fear of something known, something kept close within her heart. Later, walking home beneath the snow-laden trees, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to wander back over the evening of the party. She pictured Lucy moving about the room with her tray, the parcel lying beneath the Christmas tree. Anyone might have placed it there earlier in the day. The vicarage door was always open to visitors, and neighbors had been in and out helping Griselda with decorations. It was, in fact, the perfect opportunity. To fix upon Lucy simply because she had carried the package last was convenient, but it ignored a far larger possibility that the deed had been done before the party began. Meanwhile, Edmund Blackwell had become even more withdrawn. He appeared in the village seldom, and when he did, he carried himself with a kind of wary pride that only deepened the whispers around him. Mrs. Price Ridley declared she had seen him standing at the churchyard late one evening, gazing at the graves. Morbid, she called it. Quite morbid. Who knows what dark thoughts occupy his mind? Colonel Melchett, on the other hand, argued loudly that the whole affair was likely a business matter. "Mark my words," he said over and over at the Blue Boar, "Blackwell's dealings abroad were not above board. Someone has followed him here, someone determined to see him pay." Miss Marple, listening unobtrusively to all this chatter, recognized the familiar rhythm of village suspicion, how quickly it shifted, how eagerly it fastened itself to whomever seemed most different. Edmund was convenient. An outsider returned home burdened with mystery. Lucy was convenient, a nervous servant with no power to defend herself, and yet the truth she knew was rarely so obliging. Her certainty of this grew when 2 mornings later she encountered Edmund himself on the lane. He was striding quickly, his coat collar turned up, but he slowed when he saw her. There was something almost pleading in his eyes, though his voice when he spoke was steady. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might trouble you for a word." "Of course." "Mr. Blackwell," he glanced about as though ensuring no one lingered within earshot. "I know what the inspector thinks. That girl, Lucy, he's wrong. I'm not fool enough to miss what's being said. But she had nothing to do with it. I can promise you that." "Indeed." Miss Marple's tone was mild. "You speak with much conviction. May I ask why?" His gaze flickered, betraying the hesitation of a man caught between silence and disclosure. Because I know something of who might have sent it. But it is not my place to accuse, not yet. I only beg you not to let that poor child be made a scapegoat. Miss Marple regarded him with a kindly but penetrating eye. "Secrets, Mr. Blackwell, have a way of festering if kept too long. Sometimes a confidence wisely placed can ease a burden." But Edmund shook his head. "Not yet," he said firmly. "Please understand. I will speak when the time is right. Until then, I ask your patience." He tipped his hat and moved on, leaving Miss Marple with her thoughts. His words had only confirmed what she already suspected. Edmund was concealing knowledge. But whether out of pride, fear, or guilt, she could not yet determine. That evening, Inspector Craddock visited her cottage, seeking her counsel in his roundabout way. He stood by the fire, rubbing his hands, and said, "The trouble is, Miss Marple, the evidence is scarce. If the parcel was placed under the tree before the party, as you suggest, then anyone could have done it. We're left with motive. Who benefits from frightening Blackwell? Who stands to gain?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking. "You see, Inspector, you are already moving in the right direction. One must always ask not only who could have done it, but who would wish to do it. Motive is like the root of a plant, hidden perhaps, but it nourishes the whole." Craddock sighed. "Motive, yes, and everyone seems to have one. Blackwell's business dealings, the family estate, old quarrels. Half the village has something against him." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet, you must consider not only who has cause to hate him, but who has the imagination to turn that hatred into such a message." Her words gave him pause, though he left still uncertain. The following morning brought a fresh disturbance. A rumor swept through the village that Edmund had been seen quarreling with Dr. Haydock outside the surgery late the night before. No one could say what words were exchanged, but Mrs. Prowse's cousin swore she had overheard Edmund's voice raised in anger, and Haydock's reply equally heated. At once suspicion shifted. Perhaps it was Haydock who bore Edmund ill will. Perhaps the doctor, privy to poisons and medicines, had been the one to craft that dreadful vial. Miss Marple, though she listened carefully to the rumor, reserved judgment. She knew Haydock well, practical, outspoken, sometimes brusque, but not a man given to malice. If he quarrelled with Edmund, it was more likely over some matter of pride or principle than over deadly intent. Still, she noted the story, for even false rumors revealed the fears and prejudices of those who spread them. By now, the village was in a state of near frenzy. Every small action was scrutinized. Every shadow cast suspicion. Lucy Carter could hardly leave the vicarage without enduring pointed glances. Edmund walked the lanes with his head high but his eyes wary. Dr. Haydock bore himself with forced indifference, and through it all Miss Marple watched, listened, and quietly assembled her tapestry of human behavior. She knew the inspector was eager to fix upon a suspect, to quiet the fears of the village, but she also knew the danger of haste. For hatred once loosed seldom contented itself with a single gesture, and in the silence of her cottage, as the wind howled beyond the window, Miss Marple felt the certainty settle upon her heart. The true author of that poisoned gift had not yet finished their work. The first move had been made. The second would follow soon, and when it came she must be ready. Would you like me to continue into the next long section, A Hidden Clue, where Miss Marple begins to notice the seemingly trivial detail that will later unravel the whole plot? The storm that had seemed to linger over St. Mary Mead these past days grew heavier, as though the very sky itself pressed low upon the village roofs. The snow, which at first had seemed festive and cheery, now lay thick and oppressive, muffling sound and isolating cottages in a white silence that only deepened the sense of unease. It was into this atmosphere of tension that the first real clue presented itself, though at the time only Miss Marple recognized its importance. Inspector Craddock, harried by pressure from his superiors, was intent upon finding a clear direction for his inquiries. Edmund Blackwell's quarrel with Dr. Haydock had been the subject of relentless gossip, and Craddock thought it prudent to question the doctor formally. He arrived at the surgery one morning, and Miss Marple, with her usual knack for being in the right place at the right time, happened to pass by just as the inspector stepped out. He greeted her, his face grim. "He's hot-tempered, that Haydock," Craddock muttered. "Admits they quarrelled, but insists it was only about some land dispute. Blackwell wanting him to invest in something or other. Still, the man has access to poisons. More than enough reason to keep an eye on him." Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly over her basket, regarded him with her calm blue eyes. "I should be very cautious, Inspector. about confusing opportunity with inclination. Many have access to poisons who would never dream of using them. And others who would have no need of a doctor's cabinet to achieve their ends. Craddock gave her a wry smile. You make it sound as though the whole village might be capable of such a thing. Oh, Miss Marple said serenely, I dare say more people are capable of it than one likes to imagine. Human nature is very much the same the world over, Inspector. One sees it in villages, in cities, and even in one's own parlour. People nurse grudges, let jealousies grow, and tell themselves that justice, by their own hand, is more fitting than forgiveness. Quite extraordinary, really, how often evil is dressed up as righteousness. Her words lingered with him even as he strode away, but Miss Marple herself did not remain at the surgery door. She followed the path around the back lane, where the snow had been disturbed by recent footfalls. It was not unusual. People often used the shortcut between the surgery and the high street, but as she looked carefully, she noticed something curious. A small scrap of paper, half trampled into the snow, lay near the hedge. With the air of someone doing nothing more suspicious than bending to examine a wayward flower, Miss Marple retrieved it. It was a torn piece from a chemist's wrapping, plain brown paper, with the faint impression of a name and address stamped in purple ink. The name itself was gone, but enough remained to suggest it had been parcelled in Much Benham, the neighbouring town where the chemist was known to keep detailed records of every purchase. Miss Marple tucked the scrap into her knitting bag without comment. Such trifles, she knew, often spoke louder than dramatic revelations. A chemist's paper did not prove guilt, but it suggested purchase. And if poison had indeed been involved in the business of the Christmas parcel, then perhaps someone had obtained it, not under the watchful eye of Dr. Haydock, but discreetly further afield. That evening, the rumour of another quarrel spread through the village like fire. Lucy Carter, still trembling under suspicion, had been seen speaking urgently to Edmund Blackwell near the churchyard. A farmhand swore he overheard the maid begging Edmund to tell the truth, though about what he could not say. At once tongues wagged anew. If Lucy was not guilty herself, then surely she was bound up in Edmund's secrets. Some whispered of a clandestine romance, others of blackmail, others still that Lucy was the pawn of a far more cunning hand. Miss Marple, listening as she poured her tea the next day with Mrs. Prowse and Miss Hartnell chattering at her table, made no protest. She never did. Instead, she quietly fixed in her mind the image of the frightened maid and the brooding young man standing in the cold shadow of the church, and she thought how often the innocent were caught in the eddies of greater forces. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, redoubled his pressure on Edmund. He arrived at Blackwell House late in the afternoon, his boots crunching over the frozen path, and found Edmund pacing the drawing-room with an agitation he could no longer conceal. You must understand, Mr. Blackwell, Craddock insisted, the village is in uproar. If you know who sent that parcel, the time has come to say it outright. Secrets will serve no one now, Edmund's jaw clenched. And if I told you, Inspector, would you believe me? Or would you laugh and say I invented it? That depends on what you have to say. Edmund gave a short, bitter laugh. Then I'll say nothing for now. But know this, the person who sent that vial will not stop. They mean to see me undone. And when the next move comes, you'll understand. Craddock left dissatisfied, muttering to himself, but Miss Marple, who had called later with a small basket of preserves, ostensibly to offer neighbourly kindness, found Edmund less guarded in her presence. He looked at her with weary eyes as though tempted to confide. You see too much, Miss Marple, he said quietly. I've known women like you before, who watch and listen while others speak too quickly. I imagine you think me guilty of some dreadful past. My dear Mr. Blackwell, Miss Marple said gently, I think only that you are very much afraid. And fear, you know, often tells us more than guilt ever does. A guilty man may bluff, may bluster, but a fearful one. That is the man who knows something will happen and cannot prevent it. He said nothing, but his silence was more revealing than words. It was the following Sunday that the village's fragile calm shattered. The congregation had gathered at St. Mary Mead's church, their breath misting in the cold air, the candles glowing faintly against the dim winter light. Reverend Clement delivered his sermon with earnest simplicity, speaking of peace and forgiveness, though it was plain his mind was troubled. And then, at the close of the service, As people rose from their pews, a sudden cry rang out near the back. Lucy Carter had fainted, collapsing onto the stone floor. In her hand was a folded scrap of paper, crumpled in her grasp. When Mrs. Price Ridley, ever eager for drama, stooped to retrieve it, she gasped so loudly the whole church heard. Written in the same spidery script as the note in Edmund's parcel were the words, "The next will not be a warning." The congregation erupted in horror. Some women wept, others whispered fiercely. Edmund pushed through the crowd to lift Lucy, his face white with fury. Inspector Craddock, present by chance, snatched the paper and studied it grimly. "This," he declared, "is no prank. It is a threat, plain and simple. And unless someone here comes forward, the next act will be murder." Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, felt her heart tighten. So it had come just as she feared. The first act had been a warning, the second a promise. And somewhere in the village, the hand that had written those words was already planning the next move. That night, as the snow fell heavily once more, Miss Marple sat before her fire with her knitting set aside. She took out the scrap of chemist's paper she had found by the hedge, smoothing it carefully. To anyone else it might appear trivial, but she knew better. In her long years of watching, she had learned that murderers often betrayed themselves, not by grand gestures, but by the tiniest, most ordinary traces, and so she began to consider who among the villagers might have reason to visit the chemist in Much Benham, rather than rely on Dr. Haydock's supplies. Their journey inconvenient for most, yet convenient enough for someone who wished not to be observed. She thought of Edmund's guarded silences, of Lucy's frightened glances, of Dr. Haydock's brusque denial, of Colonel Melchett's bluster and Mrs. Price Ridley's sharp tongue. All of them had their parts to play in this drama. But only one had tied that sprig of holly to the parcel and written those cruel words. The clue lay not in the boldness of the threat, but in the ordinariness of the detail. A scrap of paper, a chemist's stamp, a careless discard in the snow. It was enough to begin with, and Miss Marple knew it would not be wasted, for the true danger had not yet revealed itself. And when it did, she must be ready. For the life of one of her neighbors, perhaps more than one, depended upon it, would you like me to move into the next long section? Confrontations. Secrets where hidden relationships and long-buried scandals begin to rise to the surface, and Miss Marple subtly nudges conversations to reveal motives. The threat discovered in Lucy Carter's hand at the close of Sunday service spread through St. Mary Mead, like a chill wind that crept under every door. The villagers, though accustomed to gossip and minor scandal, were unprepared for something so cold and deliberate. A prank, even a cruel one, could have been dismissed, but a promise of violence written so plainly was quite another matter. For days afterward, conversations in the lanes were hushed and nervous. Women no longer allowed their children to linger in the churchyard at dusk. Men walked home with their collars turned up, speaking little, though their eyes searched the shadows as if expecting an unseen enemy to emerge. Lucy herself had not left her bed since fainting, so shaken that Griselda declared she could hardly hold a teacup without spilling. Dr. Haydock, though brusque, prescribed rest, but even he admitted the girl's fear was genuine. Miss Marple, who paid a discreet visit to the vicarage, found Lucy pale and trembling, her hands clutched together as though in perpetual prayer. She could hardly be persuaded to speak at all, but when Miss Marple, in her gentle way, remarked upon how very dreadful it must have been to receive such a note, the girl's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't meant for me," Lucy whispered hoarsely. "It's Edmund they want. Always him. But I know something, and I daren't tell because if I do—" She broke off, covering her face. Miss Marple patted her arm softly. "My dear child, sometimes the danger lies more in silence than in speech. Secrets, you know, have a habit of forcing themselves into the open whether we wish it or not. If you truly wish to keep safe, you must consider carefully whom you trust, and sometimes it is wiser to confide than to bear the burden alone." But Lucy would say no more. Outside, Miss Marple walked slowly down the lane, her thoughts busy. The girl knew something, that much was certain. But whether it was out of loyalty, fear, or guilt, she could not yet be sure. Still, it confirmed Miss Marple's instinct that the heart of the matter lay in Edmund Blackwell's past, and that Lucy, however unlikely, was entangled in it. Inspector Craddock meanwhile had grown restless. He paced about the inn one evening, speaking to Colonel Melchett and several others with irritation. "We are dealing with a person who delights in threats," he said firmly. "And such a person, if unchecked, will escalate. We must find the link to Edmund. Someone here knows it, and if they will not speak, then they will force my hand to act without their help." Colonel Melchett, blowing smoke from his pipe, nodded sagely. "The fellow's been abroad too long, Craddock. Brought trouble back with him, I'd wager. Men don't live in the colonies without rubbing someone the wrong way. Likely one of them's followed him here to settle accounts. But Mrs. Price Ridley, who was also present and never one to be silent, leaned forward sharply. "Or perhaps not. Perhaps the matter lies closer to home. Edmund's family left debts behind, and bitter ones at that. I, for one, recall quite clearly that his uncle died under very unpleasant circumstances. There were whispers at the time, though nothing proved. Such things are not forgotten." Miss Marple, who had quietly entered at Griselda's invitation, sat unobtrusively by the fire, her knitting as always at hand. She listened to the Colonel's bluster and Mrs. Price Ridley's venom, noting how readily suspicion shifted from the exotic to the familiar, from enemies abroad to resentments long buried in St. Mary Mead. And it was indeed the past that began, little by little, to surface in the days that followed. Old Mr. Hewitt, the solicitor, let slip to the Reverend Clement that the Blackwell estate had once been in ruinous disarray, nearly lost altogether through mismanagement. Only a hurried sale of certain properties had kept creditors at bay, and many of those creditors, being local tradesmen, had never entirely forgiven. The Carters among them had felt particularly wronged, for their tenancy had been unsettled at the time, leaving Lucy's father, now deceased, with little more than bitterness. When this fact reached Miss Marple's ears by way of Mrs. Prowse, who never kept a story to herself, she paused in her knitting and thought carefully. If Lucy's family had suffered at the hands of the Blackwells, that might explain her fear, her nervousness, perhaps even her entanglement in a revenge not of her own making. The sins of fathers, Miss Marple knew, often bore fruit in the lives of their children, but Edmund himself seemed curiously unbothered by these whispers. He carried himself through the village with a kind of stubborn pride, though more than one person remarked that he looked weary, as though sleep eluded him. Miss Hartnell claimed she had seen him standing at his gate after midnight, staring out into the snow, his face pale in the moonlight. One afternoon, Miss Marple encountered him near the churchyard once more. He looked tired, his coat dusted with snowflakes, but when he greeted her, there was a touch of warmth in his manner. "You walk these lanes as though nothing ever troubles you, Miss Marple," he said with a faint smile. "I sometimes wonder if you notice more than the rest of us, or less." "Oh, I notice very little of importance," Miss Marple replied gently. "But I have observed one thing, that secrets seldom stay buried, however deep one tries to put them. They have a way of rising to the surface, rather like weeds in a garden. Pull up one and two more sprout in its place." His smile faded. "Then you know, of course, that I have them." "I should not presume to say what you have or have not, Mr. Blackwell," Miss Marple replied. "Only that whatever weighs upon you, it may be safer brought into the light than left to fester in the dark." He looked at her keenly, then sighed, shaking his head. "You are wiser than most, but there are things in my past I cannot yet speak of, not until I am certain. If I accuse wrongly, it will bring more harm than silence." And with that he moved away, leaving Miss Marple with her suspicions confirmed, but not explained. It was not only Edmund who carried secrets. In the days that followed, small revelations trickled out of the villagers' conversations, each adding another thread to the tangled web. It emerged that Dr. Haydock had lent money, quietly and without public notice, to one of Edmund's ventures. The quarrel between them, whispered of in the lanes, was not merely about land, but about repayment. Or perhaps betrayal. Mrs. Price Ridley, too, had her stake. Her nephew had once courted Edmund's sister, a match that ended badly, leaving a sour taste in both families. And even the Archers at the Blue Boar were not without bitterness, for they had once hoped to purchase a piece of the Blackwell estate themselves. Only to see Edmund reclaim it, Miss Marple, sitting by her fire in the evenings, let the stories swirl about her like pieces of wool. Each was tangled, each knotted to the others, until the whole resembled a skein too hopeless to untangle. but she had learned that knots, once patiently examined, often revealed the thread that bound them. It was Lucy Carter who provided the next small but significant thread. Late one evening, when Miss Marple called again at the vicarage under the guise of bringing a warm pudding, she found Lucy alone in the kitchen. The girl was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, but when she saw Miss Marple, her eyes filled with desperate recognition. "You see everything, don't you?" Lucy whispered. "You know I'm not guilty, but if I tell what I know, he'll kill Edmund. I can't bear it, and yet I can't keep silent forever." Miss Marple sat beside her, speaking softly. "My dear child, those who threaten are often weaker than they seem. The truly dangerous seldom write their intentions down. That note you received was meant to terrify you into silence, and yet by frightening you so, it may have betrayed more than its writer wished. For in trying too hard to look strong, they have shown their hand." Lucy bit her lip, her eyes brimming. "I promised I wouldn't tell. But it was someone here, someone in the village. I saw them near the vicarage that day before the party. They were carrying a small parcel. I thought nothing of it then. But when the gift was opened, I knew." She broke off, trembling. "If I tell and they discover it was me who saw, what will happen to me?" Miss Marple took her hand, patting it gently. "You are safer than you think, my dear. Sometimes the best way to protect oneself is not to hide, but to speak. For when the truth is shared, it ceases to be a secret that can be used against you." But Lucy would say no more, only promising she might find courage later. That night, Miss Marple lay awake, considering carefully all she had learned. A villager, someone with every appearance of respectability, had been seen carrying the parcel before the party. Lucy had recognized them, though fear held her tongue. The chemist's paper she had found by the hedge was more than coincidence. It was a breadcrumb pointing outward to Much Benham. The net was drawing tighter, and though others still floundered in rumors, she could see more clearly now that the roots of this crime lay deep within old resentments, debts unpaid and loyalties betrayed. The village, outwardly peaceful, was brimming with hidden hostilities. Each revelation, each whispered scandal, each quarrel hinted at the truth. But as Miss Marple well knew, the most dangerous moment was still to come. Secrets had been unearthed, but secrets alone did not kill. The hand that had written those notes, the hand that had wrapped the holly sprig, was not yet finished. And when that hand struck again, it would be with deadly intent. She only prayed she could see clearly enough to stop it before another. Villager lay cold beneath the snow that blanketed St. Mary. Mead in those December days lent the village a deceptive serenity. The thatched roofs glistened beneath pale winter sunlight, and the lanes wound white and silent through hedgerows trimmed by frost. To the casual eye it was a scene of tranquility, the sort that adorned Christmas cards and conjured nostalgia for a simpler time. Yet beneath that charming exterior, suspicion and fear ran deep, curling like smoke into every household. The threats against Edmund Blackwell had unsettled the entire parish, and though gossip was plentiful, no one dared speak too loudly of what they truly feared, that the writer of those cruel notes meant to kill. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had seen villagers pass through many such moods before. Fear made people careless. It loosened tongues, revealed tempers, and set neighbor against neighbor. Secrets that might otherwise have remained carefully buried slipped into the open under the pressure of unease. And so, while others fretted at home or whispered in corners of the high street, she took her customary walks, knitting bag swinging gently from her arm, listening with that unassuming attentiveness that often yielded more than pointed questions. One such walk led her to the post office, where Miss Hartnell and Mrs. Price Ridley stood locked in low but urgent conversation. They broke off at once when Miss Marple entered, but not before she had heard the words debts and inheritance. With her usual air of innocence, she asked after the weather, commented on the lateness of the post, and then listened while Miss Hartnell, unable to resist, let slip that Edmund's late father had been involved in a dispute with the Carters that left bitterness lingering to this day. "It isn't only Lucy who's caught up in this," Miss Hartnell whispered, leaning close. "Her whole family suffered. It would be no wonder if someone sought revenge even years later." Miss Marple nodded politely but said little. She knew the village well enough to understand that the truth was seldom contained in any single statement, but rather scattered like crumbs across a dozen conversations. That evening, She dined with the vicar and Griselda, who, though attempting to appear cheerful, could not conceal her worry. "It's dreadful, Jane," Griselda said as she poured the tea. "The inspector comes and goes, but no one seems closer to the truth. And poor Lucy is terrified of her own shadow. She hardly eats, she hardly sleeps. I've tried to coax her to confide in me, but she shakes her head and says nothing. If only I knew how to help her." Miss Marple, who had observed Lucy closely these past days, considered her words before replying. "Some burdens, my dear, cannot be coaxed away by kindness, though kindness does much good. Sometimes a frightened person must be allowed to see that the danger they dread is already upon them, and that silence will not shield them. Fear is a very poor protection. But rest assured, Lucy will find her courage when she must." Her prophecy proved truer than she anticipated. The very next morning, a commotion broke out near Blackwell House. The maid, upon opening the door to fetch in the milk, discovered a small parcel lying upon the step. Fearing the worst, she called at once for Edmund, who opened it before her anxious eyes. Inside was nothing so overt as poison this time, but a sprig of yew bound with black ribbon. Tucked beside it was a note bearing the now familiar spidery script. The holly was a warning. The yew is a promise. The yew, of course, was a funeral tree, planted in churchyards since time immemorial. The message was unmistakable. Edmund, pale and grim, carried the parcel directly to Inspector Craddock. The inspector, though hardened to many things, was visibly shaken. "This is no mere jest," he muttered. "The fellow, whoever he is, means business. He's taunting us, daring us to stop him. By heaven, we must get to the bottom of this before blood is spilled." Word of the parcel spread through the village by afternoon, and fear deepened into dread. The symbolism of the yew was not lost on anyone. Some households barred their doors by dusk. Others spoke darkly of curses and family sins. Colonel Melchett stormed about, declaring that Edmund must have dragged this upon himself, while Mrs. Prowse insisted that Lucy had brought ill luck into the vicarage. Even Griselda, normally so light-hearted, admitted to Miss Marple that she no longer liked to be alone in the house after nightfall. Miss Marple listened, absorbed each word, but her mind lingered upon the choice of the yew sprig. Such a detail suggested not only malice but imagination, a mind steeped in symbols, one that wished to terrify as much as to harm. It was not the act of a simple brute. It was clever, deliberate, and steeped in bitterness. She thought again of the scrap of chemist's paper in her knitting bag, of Lucy's whispered admission that she had seen someone carrying a parcel before the party. The strands were beginning to draw together, though not yet in a pattern she could name. The following day brought another revelation, though it came not from deliberate inquiry, but from chance. Miss Marple, calling at the Blue Boar for a parcel of butter, found herself seated near Mrs. Archer, who, with the air of someone imparting grave importance, recounted a tale she had heard from her husband. "It was years ago, of course," Mrs. Archer said, lowering her voice, "but old Tom Carter never forgave the Blackwells. He said they'd cheated him of land that was rightfully his, and his children grew up hearing it day after day. Why, Lucy herself must know those stories by heart. You mark my words, Mrs. Marple, grudges like that don't die with the man. They live on in the blood." Miss Marple smiled gently, as though agreeing in the abstract, but inside she felt the chill of recognition. Lucy was not the culprit, of that she felt certain, but Lucy's knowledge, inherited or overheard, was entangled in the crime. That evening, when Miss Marple called at the vicarage again, she found Lucy in the kitchen, sitting silent by the range. The girl looked up with red eyes, and after a moment she spoke in a low voice. "I saw him," she whispered, "the day of the party. He thought no one was about, but I saw him carrying the parcel. I promised I wouldn't tell, but now I think he'll kill Edmund. And if I keep silent, won't that make me guilty too?" Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "My dear, guilt is a heavy thing to carry, and silence heavier still. But you must be careful. The truth, when spoken, must be spoken wisely, not rashly. Tell me only this, was it someone from the village?" Lucy nodded, her face ashen. "Yes, someone everyone trusts." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind sharpened. That small assurance, simple as it was, carried great weight. The next day Inspector Craddock returned to Much Benham, following his own lead on the chemist's paper. There he discovered that a small purchase of strychnine, ostensibly for vermin, had been made in the weeks before Christmas. The name given was one belonging to a villager, though Craddock, bound by caution, did not yet disclose it. When Miss Marple heard of his discovery, she smiled faintly into her knitting. The noose was tightening, but fate seldom waits for investigations to conclude. That very night, as snow drifted in soft spirals through the village, a scream shattered the silence. It came from the lane near Blackwell House. Villagers rushed from their doors to find Edmund standing over the fallen figure of Lucy Carter. She lay upon the snow, her face pale as death, though she still breathed. In her hand was another note, clenched tightly even in unconsciousness. "The next will fall before Christmas." The village erupted in alarm. Lucy was carried swiftly to Dr. Haydock's surgery, where he declared she had been struck from behind, hard enough to fell her, but not to kill. Inspector Craddock raged, declaring the assailant must be caught at once. Edmund, white-faced, swore that Lucy had come to warn him of something, but before she could speak, the attack had struck. Miss Marple, who arrived soon after, looked long at the unconscious girl. Then she glanced at Edmund, whose face bore the agony of helplessness, and at the note still clutched in Lucy's hand. It was the same spidery writing, the same cruel promise, and yet, to Miss Marple's eyes, there was a new detail. Something small, something overlooked by all but those who watched closely. She said nothing. She merely folded her hands, her gaze distant. For she knew now that the hand which had written those notes was growing reckless. The pattern, once hidden, was beginning to show its shape, and when it did, she would be ready to draw the threads together and reveal what had always been true, that beneath the charm of St. Mary Mead, beneath the snow and the smiles and the Christmas cheer, lay the oldest of human motives, hatred sharpened into murder, and she feared, with all the quiet certainty of experience, that before the truth was spoken, someone would pay the price. Lucy remained unconscious for much of the night, though Dr. Haydock assured the vicarage household that her injury, while severe, was not fatal. The blow to her head had left her weak and dazed, but she would recover in time. Griselda sat with her for hours, fussing with blankets and whispering encouragement, while the Reverend Clement offered solemn prayers over her bedside. Outside the surgery, however, the villagers' speculation grew darker by the hour. That Lucy had been attacked so close to Blackwell House seemed to many the strongest proof yet that Edmund was at the heart of the matter, whether as victim or villain. Some said Lucy had discovered too much, that she had threatened to betray Edmund's secrets and had been silenced. Others insisted she had been struck while trying to warn him of a danger he still refused to name. The talk was endless, spilling out of cottages and shops until every lane echoed with it. Inspector Craddock, grim-faced and weary, did his best to calm the storm. He paced the village with questions, demanding to know who had been abroad that night. But the snow had covered most tracks before they could be examined, and the villagers, though eager to gossip, were less eager to account for their own movements after dark. It was as though St. Mary Mead itself closed its lips against him. Miss Marple, on the other hand, found that people spoke to her with ease. They always had. She was too gentle, too unthreatening, too apparently harmless to inspire caution. She walked the snowy lanes and sat in parlours, listening as Mrs. Price Ridley declared that Lucy's faint heart had finally betrayed her, that she must have stumbled into danger through foolishness. She nodded as Miss Hartnell insisted that Edmund had surely lured Lucy into some intrigue. And she smiled quietly as Colonel Melchett blustered that the whole matter was nothing but foreign wickedness brought home from Edmund's years abroad. Each word was added to the tapestry she carried in her mind, a tapestry of motives, fears, and grudges. It was not long before she paid a discreet call to Edmund himself. She found him alone, standing by the fire in the cold drawing-room of Blackwell House, his face lined with fatigue. He did not look surprised to see her. Indeed, he almost seemed relieved. "You will think me a coward, Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "for I have not spoken openly. But you must understand I have enemies, and some of them wear very respectable faces. If I speak too soon, I risk condemning an innocent man or giving my true enemy the advantage." Miss Marple took a seat, folding her hands in her lap. "It is not cowardice to hesitate, Mr. Blackwell. Prudence has saved many lives. But there comes a point when silence is more dangerous than words, and I fear you are drawing near to that point." He regarded her steadily, and for a moment she thought he might unburden himself. But then his expression hardened and he shook his head. No, not yet. But I beg you, keep Lucy safe. She does not deserve to be caught in this. She may know more than you think, Miss Marple said gently. He started at that, then looked away. If she does, it is through no fault of her own. I never wished her to be involved. The conversation went no further, but Miss Marple left the house with more certainty than before. Edmund's guilt was not of murder, but of concealment. And concealment, she knew, was often as dangerous as the crime itself, for it allowed suspicion to fall where it did not belong. That evening, Inspector Craddock called at Miss Marple's cottage. He was tired, his face set in lines of frustration. "We are getting nowhere," he admitted. "The girl is still too weak to speak. Blackwell refuses to name his suspect, and the villagers are pointing fingers at everyone but themselves. Meanwhile, whoever struck Lucy is still free, and likely planning his next move." Miss Marple poured him tea and listened patiently. When he had finished, she said in her mild way, "You told me once, Inspector, that the chemist in Much Benham recorded a purchase of strychnine under a villager's name." He frowned. "Yes, I hesitate to reveal it until I am sure." "Quite right," Miss Marple agreed. "But tell me, was it a name one might expect or one that surprised you?" He hesitated, then sighed. "It surprised me. It was not a person I would have thought capable." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her knitting needles clicking. "That, I think, is the key. We must always look to those who seem least capable, for they are the ones most often overlooked. And what better disguise for malice than respectability?" Craddock gave her a sharp look. "Oh, you suspect someone already?" "Oh, I never suspect," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile. "I merely observe, and I have observed that the person we seek has both imagination and patience, two qualities not commonly found together. The holly, the yew, the notes, such gestures are not impulsive. They are crafted. That narrows the field considerably, does it not?" Craddock stared into his tea, as though trying to summon the courage to believe her. 2 days later, Lucy regained enough strength to whisper a few words to Griselda. Miss Marple was present, sitting quietly by the bed. The girl's voice was faint but clear enough. "I saw him the day of the party. He had the parcel. But if I tell, he'll kill Edmund." Miss Marple leaned forward. "My dear child, you need not fear. The truth once spoken cannot be silenced again. Who was it you saw?" Lucy's lips trembled. She looked from Griselda's anxious face to Miss Marple's kind eyes. "It was— No, I can't, not yet." And she turned her face away, tears slipping down her cheeks. Miss Marple did not press her. She knew that Lucy would speak when her courage overcame her fear. But in that hesitation, in that trembling refusal, Miss Marple felt her own suspicions harden into certainty. Lucy had seen someone the village trusted, someone she dared not accuse openly. That night Miss Marple sat by her fire, piecing together the threads. Edmund's silence, Lucy's fear, the chemist's parcel, the symbolic gifts, all pointed to a mind clever enough to disguise hatred as warning and ruthless enough to strike without remorse. She thought of the villagers one by one, weighing their characters as she might weigh apples in her market basket. Some were too blunt, too open, incapable of subtlety. Others were clever but lacked malice. Only one combined the qualities she sought: outward respectability, inward bitterness, and the imagination to cloak cruelty in ritual. She set down her knitting, her expression grave. The pattern was complete. She saw it now as clearly as if it was stitched into her wool. But she did not speak, not yet. Timing, she knew, was everything. The truth must be revealed at the right moment, when it could not be denied. And so she waited, her eyes fixed on the snow falling steadily outside her window. Somewhere in the village the murderer watched too, growing bolder with each act. The next move would come soon. And when it did, Miss Marple would be ready, not with accusations or bluster, but with the quiet, devastating certainty that comes from seeing human nature for what it truly is. For in St. Mary Mead, behind lace curtains and warm fires, hatred still walked, cloaked in respectability, and the time was fast approaching when it would strike its deadliest blow. The snowfall continued, blanketing St. Mary Mead in a stillness that seemed almost reverent, yet the atmosphere within the village was anything but peaceful. The attack on Lucy Carter had unsettled everyone, and the ominous note clutched in her hand lingered in people's minds like a tolling bell. The phrase, "the next will fall before Christmas," was repeated in whispers across parlours and shops, and each villager, no matter how rational, could not help but wonder whether they themselves, or someone they loved, was destined to be that next. The season of joy had been transformed into one of dread, and all eyes now turned uneasily toward Edmund Blackwell, whose shadowed past seemed to hold the key to it all. Inspector Craddock doubled his efforts, prowling the village with questions, his voice brisk, his expression stern. He asked about movements on the night Lucy was struck, about visitors seen on the lanes, about letters or parcels carried. Yet every answer seemed to sink him deeper into confusion, for none provided the clarity he sought. There was no stranger lurking in the shadows, no unknown figure who might have carried out the attack. The web tightened around those familiar faces who had shared tea and gossip for years, and that was precisely what made it so difficult to see clearly. Miss Marple, as always, did not join the inspector in his formal questioning. She simply continued her walks, her calls, her quiet visits, observing the smallest details that others overlooked. She noticed, for example, that Mrs. Price Ridley, usually so keen to gossip, now spoke with unusual restraint whenever the matter of the notes arose, her sharp eyes darting away whenever the subject was mentioned. She noticed, too, that Dr. Haydock had grown brusquer than ever, snapping at patients for trifling complaints, as though irritation masked some inner turmoil. Colonel Melchett, for his part, was louder than usual, declaring with booming certainty that he had seen the culprit near the churchyard that night, though on closer examination it became clear he had seen nothing more than a shadow and had filled the rest in with imagination. It was Edmund, however, who remained at the centre of the storm. He walked with his head high, but the strain upon him was visible. Miss Hartnell reported seeing him pacing his garden after dark, muttering to himself. Mrs. Archer at the Blue Boar claimed he had been seen with a letter in his hand, which he thrust quickly into his pocket when approached. The villagers concluded what they always concluded, that Edmund was hiding something, and in this at least they were not wrong. Miss Marple chose her moment carefully. One afternoon she visited Edmund at Blackwell House, bringing with her a small basket of scones, an offering that appeared perfectly ordinary, but which, as she well knew, disarmed even the most guarded of men. Edmund received her politely, though his eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a man worn thin by both suspicion and secrecy. "You are kind, Miss Marple," he said, setting the basket aside. "But I cannot help thinking you have come for more than neighbourly goodwill." Miss Marple smiled faintly, settling into a chair. "Perhaps. I find that people often need company more than they admit, especially when they are under such a cloud. And you, Mr. Blackwell, are very much under one." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The inspector presses me daily, and the villagers glare at me as though I were a criminal. I could bear that if only I knew Lucy was safe. But she is not, and I fear she may yet pay the price for something that is truly mine." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she began to knit, her gaze fixed on the wool. "It would ease you, perhaps, to speak of what weighs upon you. Secrets, you know, have a way of harming the innocent even more than the guilty." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a heaviness that seemed to drain him, he began. "When I was abroad in Africa, I entered into a partnership, one that was not entirely honourable. There was money to be made in land, in trade, but it required risks, and I took them. I thought myself clever. Instead, I was betrayed. A cousin of mine, John, had lent me money on the estate, but I could not repay him. He swore he would see me ruined. He died before he could act upon his threat, but I never forgot the bitterness in his eyes, and now I cannot shake the thought that someone carries his grudge for him." Miss Marple looked up, her eyes gentle but piercing. "And you believe that person is here in St. Mary Mead?" Edmund nodded. "Yes, I feel it in every note, every threat. This is not the work of a stranger. It is someone who knows me, someone who has waited years for their chance." Miss Marple listened without interruption, weighing his words. His story explained much, but not all. The notes bore a precision, a deliberate cruelty that suggested not only resentment but calculation. It was not merely a grudge. It was a performance designed to terrify before it destroyed. That night, as she sat alone by her fire, Miss Marple considered again the details that had so far been revealed. The holly parcel at the vicarage, the yew sprig at Blackwell House, the chemist's wrapping paper by the hedge, the note in Lucy's trembling hand. Each piece on its own might be explained. Together they formed a pattern too deliberate to be ignored. And one detail in particular now pressed upon her mind. Lucy had seen someone with the parcel before the party, and that someone was trusted. It was precisely that word, trusted, that guided her thoughts. The next day, Miss Marple made a series of visits that appeared to outward eyes entirely innocuous. She called upon Mrs. Price Ridley, remarking upon the difficulty of keeping warm in such weather. She stopped by Colonel Melchett's, admiring his wife's new curtains. She even paused at the Archer's Inn for a glass of hot cordial. In each place she listened more than she spoke, and in each she asked, oh so casually, about errands to Much Benham. Most had some reason to go, shopping, visiting, errands for servants. But one answer struck her as carefully rehearsed, too quick, too certain. And in that moment she knew she said nothing, not yet. Timing, she reminded herself, was everything. Her patience was rewarded sooner than she expected. That evening a cry rose once again in the village. This time it came from the churchyard, where a small group of carolers had stumbled upon a figure lying motionless beneath the yew tree. It was Edmund Blackwell. He was not dead, though his head had been struck and blood matted his hair. By his side lay another note pinned with a holly sprig. The poisoned soul will not see Christmas. The villagers were horrified. The attack was no longer a matter of threats. It was attempted murder, brazen and unashamed. Edmund was carried to his house, where Dr. Haydock tended him with stern efficiency. Inspector Craddock raged at the assembled crowd, demanding that someone come forward with what they knew. But no one spoke. No one dared. Only Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, allowed her gaze to linger on the note, on the sprig of holly, on the trembling faces of her neighbours. And in her heart, she knew the time for patience was nearly at an end. The murderer had grown reckless, emboldened by each act. Soon they would strike again, and next time they would not fail. As she walked home through the snow, her breath clouding the cold air, Miss Marple considered her course. She had the pattern in her hands now, as clear as the stitches in her knitting. She had seen the slip, heard the rehearsed answer, noted the imagination that clothed malice in symbols. The question was not whether she knew the truth, she did, but how to draw it into the open so that all might see it. And so she resolved upon a plan. She would set a quiet test, a little game of psychology to reveal the truth before the murderer could claim their final victim. It would be delicate, requiring patience and care. But Miss Marple, with her lifetime of watching human nature unfold in drawing rooms and garden parties, knew just how to do it. Christmas was only days away. The village braced itself in dread, but Miss Marple, in her calm and unassuming way, prepared to draw the net closed. For she knew that beneath the smiles and respectability of St. Mary Mead lay the hand that had penned those notes, wrapped those sprigs, struck those blows, and soon, very soon, that hand would betray itself. The village held its breath in the days that followed the attack on Edmund Blackwell. The notes, the poisoned vial, the yew sprig, all the dark little symbols of hatred, had escalated until violence could no longer be denied. People shut their doors early, pulled their curtains tight against the falling snow, and whispered prayers that Christmas might pass without bloodshed. But behind the fear was a hunger, too, for resolution. The villagers longed to know who among them had woven terror into their midst. Inspector Craddock worked furiously, but the case seemed to him like smoke slipping through his fingers. Every time he pressed one suspect, another alibi arose. Every time he thought he saw a motive, it dissolved beneath closer scrutiny. Only Miss Marple seemed calm. She went about as usual, knitting, taking tea, making her little visits, and if anyone remarked upon her composure, she would only smile and murmur that Christmas was a time for patience. What no one guessed was that she had been quietly setting her trap. It was the evening before Christmas Eve when Miss Marple invited a small gathering to the vicarage. Edmund Blackwell, pale but recovering, Dr. Haydock, brusque as ever, Colonel and Mrs. Melchett, Mrs. Price Ridley, stiff with self-importance, Lucy Carter, still weak but determined to stand, and Inspector Craddock, who looked puzzled at the summons but agreed nonetheless. They gathered in the drawing-room, where only days before the first dreadful parcel had been opened. The Christmas tree still stood in its corner, though the baubles and candles now seemed to flicker with a more ominous light. Miss Marple, seated by the fire, her knitting needles resting on her lap, began in her mild, unthreatening way. "I dare say you all wonder why I have asked you here," she said, "but I thought it best to clear the matter before Christmas. We have had enough shadows over our festivities, and I believe it is time to set things right." Craddock gave a short nod. "If you've something to add, Miss Marple, I'd be glad of it." "Lord knows we've little enough to go on." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is not for me to tell you your business, Inspector, but I have seen enough of human nature in my years to recognize certain patterns. And what we have here is a very old pattern indeed. Resentment, dressed up in symbols, carried out with imagination and patience. A rare combination, if one knows what to look for." The room stirred uneasily. Edmund sat forward, his hands clenched. Lucy's eyes darted from face to face as though bracing herself for what might come. "The first parcel," Miss Marple continued gently, "was not slipped beneath the tree during the party, as Inspector Craddock first believed. It was placed there earlier in the day. Lucy saw it carried in, didn't you, my dear?" Lucy nodded faintly, her lips trembling. Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. Yes, she saw someone trusted, someone she dared not accuse. And she was quite right to be frightened, for that person has grown bolder with each act. The holly, the yew, the notes, all meant to terrify before the final stroke. "It is the behavior of someone who wished not merely to kill but to punish," Mrs. Price Ridley gasped. Colonel Melchett harumphed loudly. Craddock leaned forward. "And who, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's gaze turned very slowly toward Mrs. Price Ridley. The room fell utterly silent. Utterly silent. At first, Mrs. Price Ridley stared back in outraged disbelief. Then her color rose, her lips trembling. "How dare you, Miss Marple? How dare you accuse me of such wickedness? I am a respectable woman, and Respectability," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "is an excellent cloak. But it is not impenetrable. The notes were written in a very distinctive hand, neat, spidery, precise. I have seen it often enough on envelopes in the post office queue. The scrap of chemist's wrapping paper I found by the hedge bore the Much Benham stamp. It was you who travelled there, Mrs. Price Ridley, to buy strychnine under false pretences. Not for vermin, but for Edmund." All eyes turned toward the woman. She had risen now, her breath coming fast. "Nonsense! Utter nonsense!" But Miss Marple's voice, though mild, was steady. "You hated Edmund because of what his family had done. Years ago your nephew's engagement to Edmund's sister ended in scandal, and you never forgave it. You told yourself the Blackwells were poisoned souls, unfit to mix with decent folk. When Edmund returned to St. Mary Mead, you saw your chance to avenge the past. Not with an open blow, that would have been too dangerous. No, you preferred to torment him, to frighten him, to make him live in dread before striking the final blow. That is why you used symbols, the holly, the yew. You wished to appear as fate itself, delivering judgment." Mrs. Price Ridley swayed, her face ashen, her hands clutching the back of a chair. For a moment, she looked as though she might deny it still. Then her composure cracked. Her voice, when it came, was shrill with bitterness. Yes, I hated him. His family disgraced mine, and the whole village laughed at us. My nephew's life was ruined, while the Blackwells went on as though nothing had happened. And then he comes back striding about as if he owns the place, as if we should forget. Well, I would not forget. I would make him suffer as we suffered." Her words rang through the room, dreadful in their venom. Edmund sat back, his face white. Lucy gave a sob of relief and horror combined. Craddock rose, his expression grim, and laid a heavy hand on Mrs. Price Ridley's arm. "That will do," he said firmly. "You'll come with me now." Mrs. Price Ridley sank into the chair, spent, her face twisted with fury and despair. She did not resist as the inspector led her from the room. When the door closed behind them, silence fell once more. It was Miss Marple who broke it, her voice gentle. "It is always the same, you know. Old resentments allowed to fester, grow into poison more deadly than anything in a bottle. Mrs. Price Ridley told herself she was serving justice, but it was only hatred in disguise. A sad thing, but not uncommon." Griselda dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Edmund rose unsteadily, bowing his head toward Miss Marple. "You have saved my life," he said hoarsely. "How can I thank you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, returning to her knitting. "There is no need for thanks, Mr. Blackwell. It is enough to remember that hatred left unchecked will always destroy more than it avenges. The best one can do is to forgive, though it is never easy. The villagers, when they heard the truth, reacted with astonishment and dismay. That Mrs. Price Ridley, of all people, so proper, so pious, could be guilty of such wickedness was almost beyond belief. Yet when the facts were laid out, no one could deny them. The shock lingered for days, and the Christmas that followed was quieter than usual, touched by unease. But as time passed, the village began to settle once more. Lucy recovered, pale but smiling. Edmund, though scarred by the ordeal, walked the lanes with more openness, his head no longer bowed beneath suspicion. And Miss Marple, sitting by her fire with her needles clicking softly, reflected with calm resignation upon what had passed. It was, she thought, a most human story. Love turned to bitterness, pride curdled into hatred, and a respectable face hiding a poisoned heart. Such things were not new to her. She had seen them before, and she would see them again. For though the snow might cover the village in purity, beneath it, as always, lay the tangled roots of human nature. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, ever patient, would be there to see them.